So mine is going to be the hardest act now, because after those 3 speeches, I don't know how I'm going to actually improve on them. So thank you for your patience in advance. So if I have to summarize what I'm going to say today, I think the phrase that I'm going to leave behind, and maybe you can mull over this and let it digest, it's Triveni Sangam. Okay, so yeah, that's there in Prayagraj, but India is undergoing a Triveni Sangam. It doesn't happen very often in the history of the world. Nations don't go through this that often, but India is. And that is actually the foundation for why I am so bullish on the future of this country. So as His Holiness Sadhguruji said, the benefit that India has is it's modern in its ways, but the foundation, the ancient foundation, provides a kind of grip that very few countries in the world have. I dare say nobody actually has. So what is this Triveni Sangam? The Triveni Sangam is the confluence of political, social, and economic factors. And they're all coming together actually in today's India, like never before in India's own history, but also almost never before in world history. I'll actually start with the social factors, and then I'll talk about the economic factors, and the political thing is the easiest bit. So India is undergoing a social transformation. It may not be visible to your naked eye, but what has happened in the last 10 years is unprecedented. We've had actually something that is unthinkable, say 10 years ago. There's been a dramatic decline in female feticide. People have stopped killing female infants. That was rampant in this country. We had a gender ratio which was skewed towards men. Therefore, there were plenty of men who did not have female partners. That has actually reversed now. There's been a 5% decline in our gender ratio in 10 years. It's a mega change. It doesn't happen in a decade. 5% change in gender ratios takes much longer than a decade. But that was the extent of female feticide we had only a decade ago. And this has got far-reaching consequences on nation building. When you start respecting the girl child, you get a big change. And by the way, this girl child is also going to school now, thanks to the midday meal and thanks to the QR codes that are being sent to poor people. And I'll come to that in a moment. The second big social change is that infant mortality has declined by almost 25% in the last 10 years. So we have managed to deliver, and this is despite COVID, by the way. Okay, so this includes the 2.5 years of COVID. So despite COVID, we managed to reduce the number of infants that are dying in this country, and this has got dramatic consequences again, to the future of the nation. The third big change, that has gone under, that this has also happened only in 10 years. It's amazing. Our fertility rate has dropped by 25%. And when I saw the data, I was stunned. Now we are, actually as a country, we have a fertility rate which is 2. So that's below reproduction, that's below the replacement rate. Replacement rate for a population is 2.1. We're now at 2. And that aggregate fertility rate, of course, there are variances. In South India, that number is now is 1.6 or 1.7. In North India, it's still 2.4. So there are variances across the country, but on the nation average, we're at 2, which means that we're going to have fewer kids to support in the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years. You see, the last 100 years or the last 80 years, we've spent a lot of our resources growing up kids. And when you are spending so much of resources growing up kids, you have very little left to do other things. And actually, as a consequence, you remain poor. That is about to change because the number of kids that are getting born in this country now is falling. Don't worry, our demographics are still intact. It won't be until the turn of this century, so long after I've left this planet, that our population will actually decline. China's population declined last year, is going to continue to decline, and we'll come to that later. I think Smita has a question for me, so I'm not going to take it up right now. But these are dramatic social changes that are happening. And if you think about what happened and why did this take place? It all goes back to the Prime Minister's vision of promoting women and promoting the girl child. So we're achieving gender equality in a very natural way. Now, also what has happened on the social arena is something called direct benefits transfer. I'm sure all of you have heard about DBT. DBT has been a revolution. And again, Bangalore is a big contributor to this because Nandan Nilekani seeded Aadhaar. I've done a video with Nandan actually. It's on YouTube. Please watch it. It's 12 minutes, very short, very crisp. He explains what Aadhaar is. And I'll steal the thunder here. So like GPS answers the question, where am I? Correct? Aadhaar answers the question, who am I? And when you know who you are, I mean, when somebody knows who you are, then, a myriad of transactions actually take place. So you can do a financial transaction, you can do a property transaction, you can do a goods transaction. So it has been a revolution, which, by the way, is not available in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is looking at us in a quizzical way as to what exactly is this India stack and what exactly is happening. And India stack is just unfolding at the rate of knots. But what Aadhaar did was allow the government to take its entire social transfers away from the age-old, physical, archaic ledger keeping, where people would come in and sign and claim what the government wanted to give them but never get it because the middlemen would take away most of it, into technology-driven, bank account-driven direct transfer. I was just adding up the numbers. In the last 9 years, the Indian government has transferred almost $400 billion to poor people. Now, in 2015, I had done this calculation. In the preceding 30 years, we had transferred $500 billion to poor people. I dare say a lot of it did not reach poor people, and which is why we did not see significant shifts in poverty. I don't know if you have just seen the report that came out last week from the United Nations, which talks about poverty in India. It is stunning. It's gone down like this. It's not gone down like this. It has gone down like this. So they have given data for 2011, 12, 2016, 17, and 2022. So despite COVID, we have experienced a dramatic decline in poverty. And I would actually say that DBT has been a very big foundation to this. So these are social changes that happen once in a generation. They don't happen often. And they are the bedrock of society progress, as the Honorable Sadhguruji said, that unless you have equal society, you cannot expect progress because you will otherwise get social threats. And I think India is probably going to escape from that social threat, which the rest of the world is experiencing in a dramatic way right now. So that's social change, the first river that's flowing into the Triveni Sangam. The second river is economic change. So again, if you just reflect on the changes, and there have been many of them, so I'm not going to be touching upon every little change. I'm going to highlight 3 of them. The first change was with respect to supply side reform. So we have engineered major changes on the supply side. We have lowered corporate taxes, we have implemented GST, we have implemented the Real Estate Regulation Act, we have implemented the IBC, and we have enhanced our infrastructure. We actually did some work last week, which is still work in progress, but it showed that per capita infrastructure in India today is now ahead of China in many sectors, like airports, like railways, like, a little less so in the case of ports. But we have had dramatic shifts that have happened in a very short period of time in a long duration sector like infrastructure. So port turnaround times have reduced, the travel time on roads is reduced, therefore inventories in the pipeline have reduced. Business has become genuinely easy. I concur with Dr. Bala that it is not easy to do business in India, but it's a lot easier than it was 10 years ago. And I think all of you will agree with that. So the delta matters, even though the absolute level is still not satisfactory, and it should never be satisfactory. We should always strive for improvement, but I think we're getting there. Then, of course, all the tax law changes that have happened. We've seen the effect of GST. It has certainly reduced leakages in the system. It has probably reduced corruption. It has increased revenue collection for the government, which then makes it easier for the government to deliver services to citizens. It becomes easier for the government to ensure that there's greater equality in the system. And this idea about equality actually in economics is not a social concept. It's not coming out of socialism or communism. It actually came in the 1930s by a US economist by the name of Kenneth Arrow. So I don't know how many of you know about Kenneth Arrow, but he received a Nobel Prize for writing this piece about how capitalism can succeed, because capitalism invariably produces extreme outcomes. So very few number of people become very rich. The rest of the society gets left behind. I mean, this is the problem that communism was trying to solve and failed, because states tend to be corrupt, and therefore communism failed. But capitalism, succeeds only, according to Kenneth Arrow's seminal paper, if governments can transfer money or transfer cash or in kind to the people left behind, so that they have a chance in the race to becoming materially rich. And this is about if I am in a 100-meter dash against the world champion, there's no way I'm going to be able to win the race. If I get a 30-meter head start, I will still lose, but the race will become interesting. So that was the idea behind Kenneth Arrow. Now, government after government, country after country has tried to do this, has tried to distribute and undertake social transfers, but it's not been a very successful endeavor. Unintended consequences happen. The latest one in COVID, when the US government tried to help poor people who were getting affected by COVID because of loss of jobs, and transferred $800 cash into their bank accounts every month. What they've been left with now is, rampant inflation, for which, the Fed has to raise interest rates at the fastest clip in almost 40 years. And who knows what that is going to now cause in the US economy. India, by the way, didn't go down that path, because we had India Stack. So we actually transferred QR codes, which allowed poor people to encash in terms of grains rather than cash. In fact, I was privy to a conversation from a bureaucrat who said that the Prime Minister had met several experts just around the time of COVID. And after those meetings, had famously told the people in the government that, and this is way back in March 2020. So imagine the insight that he got from something that was totally unknown. We had no idea what COVID was going to do to us. We only could guess, and even our best guesses were probably going to be wrong. And he had famously said that ये जो बीमारी है, ये अमीर की छाती पे वार है और गरीब की पेट पे लात है. तो हमें गरीबों को खाना देना है और अमीरों के लिए अस्पताल बनाना है. और यही करना है बस. लोग तो मरेंगे, वो तो हम जितने कम मरते हैं उतना अच्छा है. So this is the insight that he had, and that is why India has not had the inflation problem that the rest of the Western world particularly has been facing, because we actually had a much better system of social transfers. So social transfers, are important, and that is something that we have done very well. But this whole supply side reform is I think the basis for the improved growth rate that India is likely to experience. The second big change that has happened, this happened in 2015, and that was flexible inflation targeting. So if you go back to prior to 2015, the central bank in India did not have a mandate. It basically followed what the government of the day asked it to. So if the government of the day said, get me growth, the central bank would cut interest rates. If the government of the day said, control inflation, the central bank would raise rates. In 2015, the Prime Minister changed that. he said that the central bank should have only a single mandate, and the mandate should be to control inflation. And the target will be fixed by the parliament. And the governor of the RBI will be answerable to the floor of the house if the RBI misses the target. This was a massive change in India's economic management. And this was coming out of the 2013 mini crisis that India faced, when all that Ben Bernanke, the then US Fed chair, had to say was taper, and the Indian currency was down 20% in a month. And stock markets were down 20%. And there was almost a crisis that we faced, and we had to raise interest rates by 200 basis points overnight. And the reason was that India was running a twin deficit which was unmanageable. We were running an inflation rate that was well into double digits. So with that experience in the bag, I think this inflation targeting, which we have, which we actually introduced about 8 years ago, has been a very big shift for the country's economy. Now, the consequences of this is that we are running macro stability like we've never seen before. And macro stability in economics is essentially you have benign inflation and good growth rates. And as a result, you run a much lower deficit with the world. So if you look at our current account deficit, it's much more manageable because we don't have these imbalances that are there. And our currency actually, of course, a lot of you will look at it as a US dollar cross, but remember the US dollar is doing this. And India is actually faring very well against non-US dollar currencies because of the fact that we have pursued flexible inflation targeting. The third big change was what I term as the 401k moment for India. So way back in 1980, the US President Ronald Reagan allowed 401k plans, which were retirement plans for US employees, to invest in equities. Until then, 401k plans did not invest in equities. What happened in the subsequent 20 years was that US households invested massive sums of money into the US equity markets. And of course, the US equity market went through a big bull run. It formed the basis for the formation of many, many businesses. The entire tech ecosystem got created in that period because capital became a lot cheaper. Again, in 2015, for the first time in India's history, we allowed the retirement funds to invest in equities. So provident funds and national pension schemes started investing in equities. And that has formed the basis for a big shift in the allocation of household balance sheets. So if you go back to 2015, 5% of household balance sheets in India were in equities, 12% in gold, 50% in property, and the rest of it in fixed deposits and insurance and other fixed income securities. So imagine gold was 2.5 times more than equities. And gold is really a wasting asset. Yes, it may appreciate in value, but in fact, I don't even call gold an asset. To me, an asset is something that yields. A bond is an asset. It gives you a coupon. An equity is an asset. It gives you a dividend. Property is an asset. It gives you rent. Gold gives you nothing. It's just store of value. But there was great affinity in this country for store of value because we were always very nervous about our currency. We were nervous about inflation. And therefore, households in India tended to buy a lot of gold. And that was a wasting asset. It did not produce anything. It just sat there and did nothing for you. It stored value for sure, but it produced nothing. That has started to change now. And this is a huge shift in the productive dynamics of this country. Yes, we have very good demographics. We've always enjoyed good demographics, for the last 70, 80 years. We've had a young population. The population has been young for a really long time, but it's not yielded dividends in terms of growth or prosperity like economics would have predicted. In economics, demographic is a necessary factor for producing prosperity, but it's not sufficient. What you need to put on top of it is productivity. And that's the change. And in fact, what Dr. Bala spoke about is another dimension about productivity, is that if you lift the productivity in the government sector, and if you lift productivity in the social sector, and if you lift it in the private sector, you get a massive surge in productivity overlaid on strong demographics that India has, you basically generate much better growth. So I think we are set up for that now because of the change in which saving is happening in India, which is more productive saving is taking place with equity markets grabbing greater share of household balance sheets, which will then get funneled into startups, which will get funneled into risk enterprises, and that creates growth. So these are three big mega changes that have happened in economics. Again, as I said, there are so many of them. We've written a detailed report about how many changes have happened. I can't cover all of them, but I thought I'll focus on the top three. And then the third river that is joining this Triveni Sangam is politics. Now, you know, as a nation, we've always been defensive. We've been subservient to, you know, the colonial mindset. And, you know, how can you blame this country? Because the colonial era was about destroying this country's foundations. And I tell this to a lot of people, especially, you know, the younger generation in my office, who don't understand these things automatically. I said, think about Vastu Shastra. So when somebody tells you about Vastu Shastra, you will say, oh, that's all superstition. I don't believe in it. But there's deep science embedded in it. Why should the master bedroom be southwest facing? It's a lot of science embedded there because India sits in the northern hemisphere. During summer, the sun is on the northern side, and therefore it is actually very warm. The bedroom, the main bedroom of the house should be on the southern side and on the southern western side because you don't want to be exposed to the rising sun. And then in the winter, the sun moves to the southern side when temperatures are much lower and you want the heat of the sun, which is what the master bedroom gets. This is a lot of science embedded which has been lost because the colonial Raj basically impressed upon us that these are superstitions that you need to abandon. And as a consequence, I think we lost a lot of our, I think a lot of the insights that our, you know, ancient rishis produced. And, you know, as I tell people, the Western world produces insights by observing the world from the outside. The insights in this country's ancient texts have all come from going inside. And I think the inside is far more powerful than the outside. And I cite Heisenberg's principle. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Heisenberg, but in the 1920s, he came up with Heisenberg's principle, which is, and it will sound very familiar to a lot of you, that the observed is distorted by the observer. Yeah, I think, you know, somebody else said it in the Bhagavad Gita, right? Jagat mithya hai. Jagat mithya nahi hai. What you see is the problem because it is being distorted by the observer. And if that is the case, then Western science, you know, is producing insights that, you know, time and again get proven wrong. Newton said something about gravity and Einstein, you know, disproved that. And today quantum physics is still struggling with the concept of gravity. So I think somewhere along the line, getting rid of that colonial mindset is something that's going to help India make that step forward. And I'm seeing those changes actually. I'm not a very big fan of social media. It's a huge distraction. I rather spend that time sitting alone with myself. But I do, you know, track a few things because my yoga guru actually does classes on Instagram. And what I'm seeing on Instagram is the rejuvenation of ancient Indian science. A lot of those insights are now coming back. And hopefully younger generation in India regain that confidence that we actually can, you know, deliver this and we are not subservient to any other class or any other society. So with these changes afoot, I think we should see a pretty big shift in India's progress as a nation, particularly relative to the world. Now I'll spend a few minutes on the world because the world is looking very messy. And this is a problem for India because at a time when we are becoming Atmanirbhar, and Atmanirbhar is being wrongly interpreted by people as inward. It's not inward, it's self-reliance. There's a big difference between inward-looking economy and self-reliant economy. A self-reliant economy will trade a lot more with the world. But the world is not looking good. The world is not looking good because the world is challenged by 4 Ds. The first is demographics. It's aging rapidly. Even America has aged in the last 10 years, like it hasn't in the previous 2 or 3 decades. China's population, as I said, is already declining. Japan is already in the 50s. And, as my erstwhile economist, Morgan Stanley economist Steve Roach used to say, Europe is an open-air museum because it's got a lot of old people. So, the world is aging, and therefore, it's going to be hard for the world to grow. On top of it, it's also ridden with a lot of debt. So, what is debt? Basically, debt is spending your future. When you borrow money, you've just spent your future because now your future income will be used to pay down that debt. The world has largely spent away its future. America sits on 200% private debt to GDP. China sits on 220% private debt to GDP. Europe sits at somewhere between 180 and 250%. They've all consumed their future. India, by the way, sits at 58%. We yet to consume it, though I keep telling people that the next 2 generations are going to spend their future away. Because I think we have learned that it's a nice thing to do, which is you can consume a lot more if you borrow money. And hopefully they are listening to Sadhguruji and not going to do that. But unfortunately, we will do that. The upshot is that in the next 2 generations, we'll experience very good growth. The downside is that beyond that, we will be in a similar situation. So I'll keep my fingers crossed. But that's the world. The second problem the world is facing is deglobalization. So, we've had 4 or 5 decades of globalization. Everybody trusted each other, traded well. Now, a lot of distrust is arising. And this is particularly true between India and China. Between the US and China. And as a consequence, we're going to deglobalize. Now, that has consequences on trade. It has implications on a lot of things. And I'll come to that in a moment. The third thing that is happening is digitalization. Every business needs to invest in digital infrastructure. And that's going to cost money, it's going to be expensive, and it's a disruption. And the fourth is decarbonization. Now, unfortunately, we have spent 5 million years of fossil fuel creation in 200 years. So we've released a lot of carbon dioxide, and that is obviously creating some problems. Now, I just hope that the solutions that are being presented in the world are sensible, because the other day, and I didn't read the details in the article, but I read something like NASA is talking about blocking the sun. And that's an outright disaster. Listen, the sun, in Ayurveda, this is again, Western nutrition science is totally wrong about everything. Okay, so they're changing their views, and guess what? It's basically reflecting what Ayurveda has anyway been saying for thousands of years. So in Ayurveda, the thing is that your meals should follow the sun. So when the sun rises, you should have a light meal, because the Agni, the Jatar Agni has still not awakened. Then when the sun is at the top, which is noon, that has to be your biggest meal, because the Jatar Agni is all on fire, the sun is contributing, and then the sun fades away, and hopefully, and you should not eat after sunset. Today I will be breaking that rule, but I generally don't eat after sunset. Though I did feed myself, just before this, so that I have to eat less. But the cycle of the sun is so critical to life on this planet, and blocking the sun, I hope we don't go down that path. But anyway, decarbonization is a challenge. India is ironically benefiting from all these 4. So demographics, not a problem. 27 years median age. We'll be young for a long, long time to come, long after this entire audience has left this planet. Deglobalization, I was just telling Lan earlier this evening that I have met more CEOs of multinational companies in the last 6 months than I had met in the preceding 20 years. Everybody wants to come to India to set up production. And we've written a lot of research around this. We just wrote about the electronics sector and we wrote about Apple. Apple is going to invest and make a lot more phones in India because they all have the need and the force to leave China. The US may end up legislating against tech companies in the US investing in China incrementally. And therefore, India is going to be the favored destination. There's another reason which I'll come to a little later why India is going to be the favored destination. But one of the reasons is the multipolar world which we are moving towards, where production needs to get diversified. Then decarbonization. India is another big beneficiary. Why? Because unlike the Western world, and to some extent China, our energy consumption is still very low. So I have given this statistic earlier, so some of you may have heard this. The average American consumes 9,000 watts of energy every day. That is more than the light that is there in this room. I think if you combine the air conditioning, then it's about the amount of energy that this room has consumed imagine one American, okay? That's about what 5 male African elephants would consume in the African jungles in a single day in terms of food. That's what the average American consumes. The average per capita daily consumption of energy in India is 800 watts. In fact, if you add food, this is without food, the American average goes to 9,500. And by the way, human beings cannot eat 500 watts of food. Even if you're really obese, you could probably consume 300 watts. Normal people like us will probably be eating 200 watts of food a day. What happens to the rest? Well, it goes into the bin. And I joke about this, that if Americans and Europeans stop wasting food, the world's climate change problem will be resolved. Because so much of energy will get saved. Food is modern food is the biggest consumer of energy. Imagine if you are drinking a water bottle, the amount of energy that bottle consumes in bringing that water to your table is actually criminal. So modern food industry is a huge guzzler of energy. The 800 watts in India is going to go up. Because another thing that we have achieved in the last 10 years is electricity to every village. So in India, the problem was we didn't have access to energy. A lot of our people did not have access to energy. If you didn't have access, you could not consume it. Now we have access. So we're going to consume. So 800 will probably double in the next 10, 12 years. And therefore, we can afford decarbonization because all we have to do to our existing fossil fuel capacity is add renewables. We don't have to destroy anything. Germany, the US, UK will all have to destroy existing fossil fuel capacity in order to meet COP26 targets. That entails a massive amount of capital loss, and you want to understand what that means if you have to destroy existing operational capacity in order to create new capacity that meets new regulations. So that's decarbonization. And then digitalization, India is already a few steps ahead of the world because of India's stack. So I will not go into that in greater detail. So the world is a mess. That's our biggest problem. We have to trade more with a messy world. And from time to time, that may impede some of the progress that we intend to achieve. China was a lot luckier because China was growing at a time when the world was doing very well. It was still leveraging up. It is still not aged. That's not something that we will benefit from. So in conclusion, I'm going to say 5 things that you need to look forward to. And Smita was telling me that some of you wanted to know where the equity markets are going. And we'll find out that later. But the 5 big picture conclusions, these are far more important than knowing where the equity markets are going. Because investing is about 2 things. It's about time and confidence. So not false confidence, but just adequate confidence and time. So if you have time on your side and if you have confidence, I think you will succeed. So my job here is to create that confidence. Your job is to bring the time. I cannot bring the time for you. Time means you have to be patient. Most of us want fast money, and that is, the death knell of creating wealth. You have to be very patient to create wealth. Wealth of any form, spiritual, material, all of it requires patience. It doesn't come quickly. There's no quick fix in the world. So the 5 things that you should take home. The first is India's growth rate, in my view, will be around 7%. We could grow faster. And I think Dr. Bala's work will be, one big contribution to that. In fact, people ask me that if the current regime comes back for another 5 years, what's left to do? Well, there are 2 big things left to do. One is bureaucratic reforms, which is what he's working on, and the other is judicial reform. We do have laws, but actually getting them resolved in the court, everybody knows, is a very painful and a very long-drawn process. So it's as good as not having laws. So hopefully we will build greater capacity there, and then our growth can go higher. If we actually strive to push our growth higher before capacity is built, we will run into problems. We did briefly run into a problem end of last decade, end of the first decade of this millennium, when we grew at 8.75%, which was well above our potential, and it left us with a lot of inflation to deal with. So we should not be in a hurry. We need more capacity, and really this is not about infrastructure capacity. This is about bureaucrat capacity. This is about judicial capacity. It's actually a multi-sectoral issue. It's not a mere infrastructure. Infrastructure, by the way, will get built. I am not so confident about judicial and bureaucrat capacity. So I was very enthused to see your presentation that, a lot of steps are being taken in that direction. So that's growth. So 7% is, by the way, a very good number, because if you add an inflation rate of 3 to 4%, you get nominal growth of 10, 11%. And compounding at 10, 11%, India, as people are forecasting, will be, and we are also forecasting, will be top 3, output countries in the world in the next 5 years, and we'll probably go to top 2 in the next 30, 40 years. So we'll get there just by the virtue of compounding at that rate. The world is not compounding at that rate. The second thing is that our share of global trade will rise. Now, one of the biggest failures for us has been that we have not been able to grow our trade with the world. We've done very well in services. In services, we were at 0% 30 years ago. Today, we are at, pre-COVID, we were at 3.5. Today, we are at 4.7. One of the silver linings of COVID was that multinational company CEOs realized that it's okay to work from home. And if you're working from home, you might as well work in Bangalore rather than Florida. It's damn cheap to be in Bangalore. So multinational companies have created almost 1 million non-IT services jobs in the last 2 years. So I know everybody looks at IT services, but look at non-IT services. Massive job creation happening there because of the offshoring of jobs to India. So our share in global services trade has gone to 4.7%. It's risen by more than 1% in a matter of 2 years. And net services exports, by the way, have doubled in the last 2 years. So we will gain share in global trade. I think the same story is now about to happen in manufactured goods. We've just come out. After stagnating for 10 years at 1.7%, we're now at 1.9% of global trade in manufactured goods. And I think these numbers will probably more than double in the next 10 years. So all of you should be thinking about that when you're framing your business model. And why is it important to trade? Remember, from a macroeconomic perspective, it's very important. And I'll give you a very simple example. When a poor person trades with a poor person, there is no transfer of terms of trade. In economics, we call it terms of trade, which is you get no pricing power. A poor person cannot pay more. But when a poor person trades with a rich person, a transfer of trade, terms of trade happens, which is that pricing power comes. This is exactly how India got impoverished. We transferred terms of trade for 300 years to the rest of the world, starting the 17th century all the way to the 20th century. That's why all these people got attracted to India, because we were so rich that trading with us meant we could, those who were trading with us could become richer. And that's exactly what happened. Now it's time for us to reverse this. Now we start trading with the world and transfer some of that lost or stolen wealth back to our country. So that's the second thing. The third thing that is of importance is how the consumption in this country is set to change. So our income pyramid sits somewhat like this. We have a lot of poor people at the bottom, tons of poor people. The last that I had estimated, there are probably 400 million people in this country who will not get a meal tonight. They'll not get a meal to eat. It's a very poor country. Okay? So we are outliers, extreme outliers. We don't represent this country at all. This country is very poor. It has to be, right? At $2,300 average per capita income, you're dealing with a lot of people below poverty line. That is set to change. It's already changing, actually. In fact, it has changed in the last 5 years, and it's going to change dramatically in the next 5 years. The income pyramid, which is somewhat like this, and we have about 5 million households that are rich by global standards at the top of the pyramid, that is actually going like this. The bottom layer is going to shrink, the top layer is going to expand. The top layer, I estimate, is going to go from 5 million to 25 million, which means we will add 2 crore new families or people who are rich by global standards. Nowhere else on the planet are that many rich people coming into any country over the next 10 years. And this is why Apple, Louis Vuitton, BMW, Mercedes, and you name it, all of them want to set up shop in India because this is going to be their biggest market in the next 10 years, and in fact beyond that as well. So that's consumption. Again, when you're thinking about your business, think about how this is going to impact you because a lot of things will change. That bottom layer there today is essentially spending bulk of its income on roti kapda makan. They will now generate income to spend on things other than that, which includes sending kids to school, which includes going for a vacation, painting your home, buying a tractor, buying an internet connection, buying a phone, and so on. So that is a phenomenal change that is underway already, actually, right? And it will actually gain momentum in the next 10 years. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing to note is our balance of payments. So we as a country have been subject to the vagaries of global economic cycles because of our requirement to get dollars or foreign exchange currency. Now that is about to change. I explained to you why the current account deficit is looking more benign with the services export boom, with our manufactured goods exports that are about to happen. And on top of it, with all this investment flow that's taking place, so multinational companies, private equity firms, and foreign portfolio investors all looking to buy Indian assets, we're probably going to run BOP surpluses in the foreseeable future, which is a good problem to have. It's still a problem, but it's a good problem to have. It's better than not having the money. We are going to have excess supply of dollars and other currencies, and with all these rupee trades that the government is signing up, this problem is only becoming, the good problem is becoming even bigger because a lot of countries will trade with us in rupees, and therefore we will be spending less dollars on trading with them. Notably the United Arab Emirates, Russia, and a few more such deals are getting inked. So these are far-reaching changes on the country's balance sheet. So the country's balance sheet is looking better. Now this will have implication on your business because we're all used to a certain level of rupee depreciation year after year after year after year. That rate of depreciation is going to slow. It will still depreciate because we still have a productivity gap with the world which is negative. So our productivity is less than the world, so the rupee still needs to depreciate, but the pace of depreciation is going to slow. So when you're building your business, think about that. You're not going to get easy returns from rupee depreciation. It's going to become harder as time passes over the next 10, 15 years. And the final thing is that we are in the midst of a profit boom. The government is very clear. It wants companies to make money. It wants firms to make money because only when firms make money, they can invest. Only when they invest, you get job creation. Only when you get job creation, you get all-round prosperity. So it's a different mindset from the 7 decades of socialist economic behavior that we have suffered as a country, and that is obviously good for entrepreneurs. I wrote about this way back in 2015. It was a note titled Time for Entrepreneurship, and I stick to that 8 years later. I think we are in a very sweet spot for entrepreneurship, and that may sustain for several years to come. So those are the 5 big things that you should take away. And then, its implications on the stock market should be fairly obvious. India has been amongst the best performing stock markets in the world over the past 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. Over 25 years, it has beaten the US stock markets in US dollar terms. And I think we may continue to do that over the next 5, 10, 15, 20. Thank you.